what I'll try and do is to give you a broad, the bulk of the talk is very much broad, and we're going to go quickly through it to give you a background as to why we need batteries, why we need battery research, why we need materials, and then I'm going to try and sort of quickly get into the depth of what it is that I do to get to this magic pixie dust dirt that potentially can change the American and global energy landscapes. So this is a depiction of what our energy landscape looks like today, from the generation phase to storage phase to transmission phase, and finally where it is consumed. I put in the battery category as a second step because that's where really it belongs, but that step has been largely missing. The most efficient way of storing energy today is through a hydro pump, and there are only about 6 facilities in the world, most of them in Canada, because essentially what you're doing is when energy is cheap, you're pumping water up at night into these massive reservoirs, these artificial lakes, and then you're draining them to meet demand during peak hours. And so when we're designing our batteries, we're trying to compete both with the energy efficiency and the cost of hydro pumping. The electric grid also has an important effect in the sense that most of the world's electric grids are highly inefficient. And from the first step to the consumption phase, we're losing about 20 to 30% of the energy that is generated. That is a huge problem, and we do think that the energy storage component can address it to a certain extent. Now, this is a very convoluted thing, and you're not expected to memorize it. This is from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and essentially what it shows is that 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. This is not a secret. We all know that we have our gas stoves, we put gasoline in our cars, but the biggest component is, of course, burning of coal, and now a growing component of burning of natural gas. And of course, again, this is no secret, and you do not really need such complex graphs, but again, from Lawrence Livermore, 100% of our emissions come from fossil fuels. And you may wonder, why is this, a secret? Well, some people, I guess, still have fireplaces around the city and use wood. But the important thing here is if you look for actual transportation numbers, the values are very small. It's a small fraction. So people driving cars is not what we're trying to take away. What we're trying to change is sort of minimize the coal burning component and try and move towards more efficient ways of distributing energy from the generation phase to the consumer, but also push for really big change, which is taking coal plants offline and changing them towards burning natural gas. And I'll show you the numbers for that. Now, these are projections from the Department of Energy. And if you look at these projections, and I love government projections because they're always over strange periods, and this one happens to be 45 years. What we're looking at is an increase in gas exploration, an increase in gas use, and that is, of course, forecasted to drive down the cost of natural gas, which would make, again, the transition from coal to natural gas feasible. But what we would like to see is the transition towards a greater presence of renewables. The current problem with renewables, and I know there's at least one person here who deals with this problem, is that they have a limited presence on the national grid. The reason for that being is that they cannot provide a sustained current to the grid due to fluctuations, because a cloud will pass, wind will stop, waves will change, currents will change. There are additional unpredictable elements. So for that reason, they have a very limited presence. Our technology will allow for the power generator, renewable power generator, to put it into a large battery that could fill this room, and we are working on a prototype for this summer that will power a building in Harlem. And they would power into this battery, put the charge in, and then they can sell it during peak hours back onto the grid, thereby changing them from being a power producer to a utility company, which has huge implications because we will no longer have to subsidize these industries to make them profitable. If you think of it in terms of as a taxpayer or somebody who's really interested in the environment, you're actually on the same page, because these things can become affordable and profitable, create jobs, and also be beneficial to the environment without changing our lifestyles. And I think that is why the work that we do is important, and this is the type of technology that will allow us to go forward. So why is this an important issue today, more so than ever before, is you're having an increasing demand for energy all over the world. We're seeing this with China, we're seeing it in the Middle East, we're seeing it in India. And those huge markets are emerging because they want to exist and live at the same level that we do. So we're going to see continued pressure on fossil fuels. And again, as you can see, that most of the growth going forward is going to come from non-OECD countries. So what is sustainable? And this is a very quick slide, grossly oversimplified. But you want the total cost that you spend on fuel and energy to be roughly 10% of your GDP, which means that energy costs that are more or less market ideal, except with variations for subsidies and other sort of initiatives. For the US, it should be roughly 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Germany, it should be roughly 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That's because of their added pressure and increased investment in solar panels, which are quite expensive to produce there, and they're really forcing them into the marketplace. And in India and China, it's roughly 2 cents because of the population, levels of poverty, and levels of subsidies that they have to provide access to the population to electricity. So whatever it is that we come up with must fit into this landscape to start with. And then we have to find ways of a feeder, an energy generator, to provide technology on that, energy on that additional cost. So one way to do that is, as I mentioned quickly, is to find ways to develop a grid that does not lose the 20 to 30% from the generation to the consumer. And if we can do that, and this was a mind-boggling statistic that could be disputed by that guy over there, if you do that on a global scale, if we innovate all of the grids of the world, in 1 year, it's the equivalent of not pumping oil for 2 years, globally. That's roughly, what is it, 80 billion barrels, Chet? 80 billion a day. Yeah. So it's roughly 80 billion barrels of oil not used. Of course, India and China can benefit from our advances in research and the fact that they do not have a solid infrastructure, so they can build anything at very fast rates that is the most modern. In the United States, it's a much more complex problem. But this is one way to address it. Another way to address this is what we're doing right here in New York, up in Harlem. And this is build these huge batteries. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen is one of our prototype workhorse batteries. This is a 1.6 kilowatt hour battery. It generally consists of the nickel-zinc technology, which is very standard, and we've made several modifications to the materials, because the most failure modes of all of your batteries is they self-short, meaning that as particles attach and detach throughout the chemical process, one plate will hit the other one, and you have a short circuit, and the battery is dead. We found a technique by which you can clean the surface every about 30 or 40 cycles, which is about every month. You have to clean the surface non-intrusively, and that allows you to continue running the battery without energy loss, without material degradation. This workhorse has done the equivalent, if you take 400 days to be a year, roughly 25 years worth of cycling at still 90% energy efficiency. The cost of this battery is largely driven by the need to have nickel in it. And nickel is expensive. It's a high demand material. It is in a number of different batteries. But in this case, once you have a sintered plate in there, you can get some of the material cost back. You can recycle it, but most of the time you just keep using it. There is no obvious degradation. The starting cost with the assumptions that are listed is right about 10 cents kilowatt hour per cycle. But as this is based on only about 10,000 cycles, and we've seen no reason for this to stop, this battery is still performing well, that cost will continue to drop. So once you invested in building this, it should continue to lower its operational costs as it goes on. So this is feasible. But this magical dust of manganese dioxide, which we all have in our Duracells and people have had since the 1860s, is really what is a game changer, because even at a very small number of cycles, you're looking at 2 cents a kilowatt hour per cycle. This is a wonderful thing to look at, and people have really abandoned this material because it's very difficult to work with. Now, Julian mentioned lithium, and a lot of people have hopes for lithium going forward in large scale, small scale, every scale. Lithium has really one major problem, and it's again geopolitical. If you didn't like Middle Eastern oil, you're definitely not going to like Chinese and Bolivian lithium dependence. Whenever there is an interaction between Japan and China, that is not friendly. China just cuts off the supply and waits for the Japanese to come back on their knees. And that's definitely not a position we should be in. So manganese is a workable option. And the reason why it's becoming workable now is we have something that we've never had before, and that is the ability to grow nanoparticles of these materials. And as some people know, the smaller stuff gets, the weirder things it can do. And this is exactly the case with these batteries. So again, I went over this a little earlier. These are the different components that we can address with these types of batteries. I know you can't read this, but the important thing is peak shaving is the easiest application of this technology. If you have a battery in the basement, New York now has differential pricing. Every single state in the union is going to differential pricing, meaning that off-peak hours are cheaper than peak hours. You put one of these things in. You can charge it up at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. You could use it when it's 23 cents a kilowatt hour. Thereby, this stuff pays for itself over a period of time. Plus, we don't have to ramp up production to meet the demand of the peak hour. That means we get higher energy efficiency, better environmental standards from our power plants, and they also last longer. Additionally, wind shifting I've already talked about, but another option is vehicle switching. So vehicle charging is an interesting part because we're looking at the future. We're trying to see, well, if we're trying to come off oil, are we going to have battery-powered cars? And if we are going to have battery-powered cars, it makes sense to invest in batteries all along the highway, because then you could possibly just pull over anywhere and charge it up. You don't have to go to a specific location. And at the same time, you're building in redundancies into the grid, because if there's a tree that falls in Canada and cuts off New York again, we've got 8 hours of light to sort of go home and not be stuck in elevators. So these are the transformational changes. So what are the problems? And this is where we get to the hard science of this. The real problems are chemical. Now, what you're looking at are two cross sections, that's pictures A and B, and you're looking at the surface of an electrode. When you start with this material, you're looking at just platelets of material. But you can spot right away in picture C, right in the middle, you can see little cubes forming. Now, little cubes are just one of the impurities that I have to deal with, and this is my job, is to figure out how to manage it. These are manganese hydroxide. Our electrolyte is potassium hydroxide. For those of you who took chemistry in high school, you remember that hydroxides precipitate out very easily. So if you run this thing for a very long time, the first problem that you encounter are the formation of the precipitates on the surface. And also throughout the electrode. You could see them in the cross sections. What this does is it changes the electron pathway, it creates additional resistivity, it gets harder and harder to put charge in, and the amount of charge you could put in gets lower and lower. The second problem is when you buy this material and potentially run it, it will not be all the right kind of manganese dioxide. So this is sort of dust that you have to sort out. And these fluffy little things on the surface and throughout are the delta form, not the gamma form of MnO2. So when you're actually buying these things, you have to know what you're looking for, because they'll sell you something, because they'll say, you know, this is a little cheaper, and we go for it, and then it's not the right stuff, and it doesn't do very much. And sort of our benchmarks thus far, we have number of cells going over 1,100, which surpasses the other ones by a good margin. And our prototypes are very small, and again, all of you in some kind of orderly fashion are welcome to come up to City College and see these for yourself. You know, don't show up all at once. But again, we've surpassed the 500 benchmark, which is what people believed was only possible, that you couldn't go beyond it because of the phase difficulties, because of the material handling difficulties. And we've developed methods for controlling these reactions. Again, this is, in some cases, just a computer problem issue. In some cases, it's a material sourcing issue. In some cases, it's dopants. So I'm trying to find ways of optimizing that. And most importantly, electron accessibility. The better the charge density of this material, the more energy we can store, the cheaper it'll be, the more things you can do with it. But again, we're on the right track. And the last slide is really for all those who want to cut Department of Energy. This work is exclusively funded by the Department of Energy, and it's a particular wing called ARPA-E, which is the Advanced Research Projects Administration in Energy, which has not just research aims. Our end product at the end of the 3 years and we're ahead of schedule on this, is to come up and spin off a company. So the nickel zinc technology will be scaled up and powering our engineering building by the summer, and I'm hoping that we'll introduce components with manganese in there to bring down the cost. I should recognize all of my colleagues. Some are much more distinguished than I. Sanjoy, for instance, is the vice chairman of the FERC on the safety committee. And most importantly, thank Julian and you for your attention. Thank you. Pump. And there are only about 6 facilities in the world, most of them in Canada, because essentially what you're doing is when energy is cheap, you're pumping water up at night into these massive reservoirs, these artificial lakes, and then you're draining them to meet demand during peak hours. And so when we're designing our batteries, we're trying to compete both with the energy efficiency and the cost of hydro pumping. The electric grid also has an important effect in the sense that most of the world's electric grids are highly inefficient. And what I'll try and do is to give you a broad, the bulk of the talk is very much broad, and we're going to go quickly through it to give you a background as to why we need batteries, why we need battery research, why we need materials, and then I'm going to try and sort of quickly get into the depth of what it is that I do to get to this magic pixie dust dirt that potentially can change the American and global energy landscapes. So this is a depiction of what our energy landscape looks like today, from the generation phase to storage phase to transmission phase, and finally where it is consumed. I put in the battery category as a second step because that's where really it belongs, but that step has been largely missing. The most efficient way of storing energy today is through hydro. From the first step to the consumption phase, we're losing about 20 to 30% of the energy that is generated. That is a huge problem, and we do think that the energy storage component can address it to a certain extent. Now, this is a very convoluted thing, and you're not expected to memorize it. This is from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and essentially what it shows is that 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. This is not a secret. We all know that we have our gas stoves, we put gasoline in our cars, but the biggest component is, of course, burning of coal, and now a growing component of burning of natural gas. And of course, again, this is no secret, and you do not really need such complex graphs, but again, from Lawrence Livermore, 100% of our emissions come from fossil fuels. And you may wonder, why is this, a secret? Well, some people, I guess, still have fireplaces around the city and use wood. But the important thing here is if you look for actual